In today's video, we're going to explore how the United States navigated the turbulent waters of international relations in the years following World War I, a time of shattered peace, rising totalitarianism, and growing global instability. Contrary to popular belief, the United States didn't retreat into complete isolation after World War I. Instead, it adopted a strategy of what historians often call independent internationalism, a careful balancing act between protecting American interests and avoiding entanglement in another foreign war. From disarmament treaties and diplomatic pacts to neutrality legislation and ultimately war, this period shaped the foundation of American foreign policy leading into World War II. Let's get started. World War I was promoted as a war to end all wars, with President Woodrow Wilson proclaiming it would make the world safe for democracy. But by the 1930s, faith in those ideals had dimmed. The Treaty of Versailles failed to create lasting peace, and Europe remained mired in post war instability. Meanwhile, the rise of communism in the newly renamed Soviet Union added to American anxiety. Despite these fears, the United States didn't retreat into isolation. Although it refused to join the League of Nations, it still worked to preserve peace and protect its interest abroad through diplomacy rather than military entanglements, a strategy known as independent internationalism. One key moment was the Washington Conference of 1921 into 22, held during Warren Harding's presidency. Eight major world powers met in Washington, D.C. to limit naval armaments and reaffirm the open door policy toward China. It was a significant step toward disarmament and diplomatic cooperation. Another major milestone came in 1928 with the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Signed by 62 nations, this agreement condemned war as a tool of foreign policy. Though lacking enforcement mechanisms, it was held as a hopeful gesture toward peace. The optimism of the 1920s gave way to more troubling developments in the early 1930s. In 1931, Japan defied international agreements by invading Manchuria, renaming it Manchukuo, and establishing a puppet government. The League of Nations condemned the invasion but took no action. Japan responded by leaving the League altogether. The United States, though not a League member, issued a similar protest but also stopped short of intervention. Back in the Western Hemisphere, President Franklin Roosevelt announced a shift in Latin American policy during his first inaugural address in 1933. This became known as the Good Neighbor Policy. The United States repealed the Platt Amendment and moved away from direct intervention. However, this new friendly approach still served U.S. interests through economic influence and military arrangements, such as training local National Guards and paying for base rights, often benefiting American backed and sometimes brutal leaders. In 1934, the United States was grappling with the Great Depression. Senator Gerald Nye led a congressional investigation known as the Nye Committee into why America entered World War I. The conclusion: financiers and arms manufacturers pushed the United States into war for profit. Now, this is going to spark a strong isolationist movement, resulting in the passage of a series of Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Act of 1935 prohibited arms shipments to warring nations and barred Americans from traveling on their ships. The Neutrality Act of 1936 banned loans and credits to belligerents. And then the Neutrality Act of 1937 extended the arms ban to civil wars, particularly relevant as Spain descended into conflict. Even as these laws were passed, Roosevelt quietly prepared for the possibility of war, increasing military spending and lobbying to ease restrictions. Meanwhile, the rise of fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan was impossible to ignore. Fascism, an ideology that prioritized the nation above all else, brought with it extreme nationalism, racism, and militarism. Between 1935 and 1938, fascist powers launched a series of aggressive actions. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland and demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Japan launched a full invasion of China. Britain and France, desperate to avoid another war, adopted a policy of appeasement, most notably at the Munich conference, where they allowed Hitler to annex the Sudetenland in hopes that it would satisfy his ambitions. The United States even supported this approach. President Roosevelt was alarmed but constrained by American isolationist sentiment. When Japan invaded China in 1937, Roosevelt tested the waters with his quarantine speech, urging democratic nations to isolate aggressors. The public response was overwhelmingly negative, and he dropped the proposal. The tipping point came in 1939 when Hitler violated the Munich Agreement and occupied all of Czechoslovakia. Then on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war. World War II had begun. In response, Congress passed another neutrality law allowing for cash and carry arms sales. Allies had to pay cash and transport the goods themselves. This policy, while technically neutral, clearly favored Britain and France. Roosevelt, aware of the growing danger, began shifting the United States toward involvement. In 1940, with Hitler's army overrunning France, Roosevelt won an unprecedented third term. He worked within the constraints of neutrality to aid the Allies. He appointed pro British Republicans to defense positions and enacted the first Peacetime Selective Service Act. Then, in 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed the United States to provide war materials to Britain, which could no longer afford to buy them. Roosevelt defended this move in a fireside chat, declaring the United States the great arsenal of democracy. He also articulated the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear as ideals worth defending globally. Later that year, Roosevelt and Churchill met at the Atlantic Charter Conference, where they outlined the shared war aims like disarmament, self determination, and freedom of the seas. Ironically, though tensions were highest in Europe, it was Asia that finally drew the United States into war. By 1941, Japan had expanded its empire into French Indochina. In response, the United States imposed trade sanctions, cutting off critical resources, especially oil. While diplomatic talks continued, United States intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, signaling an attack. But the target was unknown. That target turned out to be Pearl Harbor. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, Japanese bombers launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were killed. Around 1,200 were wounded. 20 ships were sunk or badly damaged, and nearly 150 aircraft were destroyed.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
The next day, on December 8th, Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. The United States was now fully involved in World War II. In less than 2 decades, America's foreign policy had evolved dramatically, from hopeful disarmament and non-intervention to full-scale mobilization for a global conflict. While the 1920s and early 1930s were marked by a cautious approach and a desire to avoid war, the growing threats of fascism, unchecked aggression, and the bombing of Pearl Harbor made isolation impossible. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.